Hi, Richard.
Hi, Katie.
I'm just catching people up with sort of what's been happening. 240 hostages were taken into Gaza. Hamas is believed to still be holding 134 people it took hostage during the attack. 32 of those hostages have been confirmed dead. Meanwhile, I'm just sort of setting up our conversation, Richard. More than 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza, including at least 12,300 children since Israel launched its offense. The UN recently warned that famine is imminent for over 500,000 of Gaza's residents, and that 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza was suffering from acute malnutrition. More than 3/4 of Gaza's 2.2 million people are internally displaced. More than 1 million are crammed into Rafah, a tiny sliver of land with a population that is now 5 times larger than it was before the war. Humanitarian aid delivery to Gaza has dwindled. The UN and other relief agencies are having a hard time delivering even small amounts of food and supplies amid Israeli entry restrictions, airstrikes, and its ground invasion. Calls for a ceasefire and hostage release have been ongoing, but there appears to be no end in sight. And this is why I wanted to have this conversation with my friend Richard Haass. He's a veteran diplomat, a very respected scholar of international relations, and President Emeritus at the Council on Foreign Relations and Senior Counselor at Centerview Partners. So Richard, hi, I'm so happy to see you because I don't think we've talked for quite a while and a lot has happened. You recently returned from a trip to the Middle East. Tell us a little bit about what you were seeing and hearing there.
Katie, it's good to be back with you, even though, as your lead-in made clear, it's pretty grim. Let's be honest. I went to several countries in the Arab world. The real frustration and disappointment. Lots of the Arab world is normalized with Israel. More of the Arab world was prepared to. It's no secret that was one of the reasons that led Hamas to do what it did on October 7th. But I think in many ways the Israelis' response has played into Hamas's strategy of disruption, and it's increased the gap between Israel and the Arab world. The Saudis now have put their own process of moving closer to Israel on hold, plus they now require, which they didn't before October 7th, Israel to be much more forthcoming towards the Palestinians. And since what the Israelis have done is, ironically enough, is put the Palestinian issue back squarely on the agenda. An entire generation of young people in the Arab world who on October 6th didn't really care all that much about the Palestinian cause, quote unquote, now do. And they're much more skeptical of Israel. They're also more skeptical of the United States. There's real disappointment in what we have done, or if you will, haven't done. And that's where we are. And here we are meeting. We're just a few days away from the start of the holiest month in the Arab world. There's attempts to negotiate a ceasefire seem to be up against the wall. And you have a situation now where the Americans and to some extent the Israelis want a ceasefire. Hamas is, at least so far, holding firm. And there's those of us who think that Hamas, and some people watching this may not like what I'm going to say, Katie, but my view is they may not want a ceasefire. Again, their goal is often to put Israelis in positions where Israel acts in ways that then Hamas can use to generate support and sympathy in the Arab and Muslim world. And fighting during the holy month of Ramadan, or the kind of humanitarian crisis you're describing, is one way to do just that. So, one of the lessons of the Middle East is bad situations can get worse. And this is one of them. This is a bad situation that has grown worse.
It seems like the latest flashpoint, Richard, was the death of 100 people who were injured. 100 people who were killed, and 700, more than 7 injured during last week's aid convoy attack in Gaza City. People were ostensibly running towards these aid trucks. They were starving. And I guess some of them got trampled, some of them got shot. I think IDF officials have said that they were approaching them in a threatening and menacing way. It seems to be 2 accounts about what happened. What are you hearing, or did you hear anything about that particular incident, and how much of a flashpoint was that?
Katie, I don't have any particular additional information on that incident, but let me say a couple of things. One is this is the sort of thing that's inevitable if you're delivering food sporadically and now from airdrops. I understand why the administration is dropping food, but that's no substitute. The numbers of meals that are being dropped are a drop in the bucket, tens of thousands when you have more than 2 million people in Gaza. Plus, you can't control distribution. And you have either kind of a mayhem that we saw the other day, or gangs will start getting control of food. And so you've removed the authority of Hamas, but there really hasn't been a substitute authority, which leads me to my second point. To the extent there's any authority, and it doesn't really exist yet, it's Israel. And what we're talking about is occupation. And occupation is never welcomed, and over time it becomes less and less welcome. So it highlights one of the many missing pieces in the Israeli policy is they don't have any legitimate, acceptable source of governance, of political authority and security to take the place of Hamas. All they've got is themselves, and they're not acceptable to the population. They talk in their so-called day after document about finding locals. Well, locals aren't going to step up because they're going to look like collaborationists. And there's enough Hamas soldiers still around, fighters still around, who will shoot at them. So I don't think Israel has thought this through, and I don't think that it has a strategy for getting from where we are to where you need to be. And that's why, again, people like me are so worried about what's unfolding.
You heard those devastating figures about malnutrition and starvation. Why isn't more aid entering the country? I understand that it's completely disorganized once it gets there, and there's no kind of systematic way of distributing the aid. But why is so little coming in?
Well, part of it is the reason you said. Part of it is Israel has not been forthcoming. There's been a desire to control borders, keep people from getting out. There hasn't been enough in. Certain people in the Israeli government see aid, I'd say, as something of a favor that's not forthcoming when you don't get cooperation for Hamas on hostages and so forth. It's part of the equation. If you think about all these ceasefire deals, what are the components? Everyone has the same components. There's a time-limited ceasefire. You have aid getting in. You have hostages getting out, and you have Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails getting out. And it's obviously the details about all of that, the duration of the ceasefire, the amount of aid, the hostage release and the prisoner release. And Hamas right now, for example, is saying that nothing can be done until Israeli forces leave Gaza. That's obviously a non-starter for the Israelis. So what you have is the food and humanitarian aid is getting caught up in this political equation.
You keep saying forthcoming. I don't know what you mean exactly by that, Richard, by that word, forthcoming.
Now you have to help me, remind me about what
you're saying that Israel should be more forthcoming.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
To the Palestinians. And I guess I'm confused about what that actually means in foreign policy parlance.
Okay, we can have subtitles here, Katie. You go Berlitz, foreign policy parlance. Parlance vu, foreign policy. So look, what that means is Israel has responded in a military way to October 7th. It's done it in a fairly, shall we say, indiscriminate way, rather than a carefully targeted and calibrated way. But let's put that aside. The principal thing that's missing from Israeli policy or strategy is a political dimension. If you don't like Hamas, you then have to give the Palestinians some other potentially acceptable leadership to follow. Well, it's not going to be Israel, obviously. It has to be Palestinians. Well, the only existing group of Palestinians other than Hamas is the Palestinian Authority. They're weak. They're not very competent. They're largely based in the West Bank. So the question is, could you begin a process where they could assume, they'd be willing and able to assume greater authority in Gaza? That process hasn't begun. You could work with Arab governments to perhaps provide some temporary security in Gaza to deal with things like food distribution, but they're not going to touch this challenge. unless they believe that Israel has introduced a serious long-term political dimension that would ultimately meet a lot of Palestinian, not all, but many Palestinian political demands for self-government and ultimately down the road for a state of their own. We've already talked about Israel not being, to use that word again, forthcoming and allowing enough food to enter. So again, to put it really bluntly, what you have is an Israeli policy, if I had to say it, that's still very much focused on retaliation for October 7th, and I understand it. But you have the rest of the world is focused more on October 8th, essentially what has come after. Israel has not been willing to make that pivot. And you have an Israeli government, quite honestly, that doesn't want to set in motion political dynamics that would increase pressures or lead to a Palestinian state.
Right.
They don't want that. So that is
That's
the
Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want that, right, Richard?
Most Israelis right now don't want that. Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want it. The United States and the Arab world and most Palestinians want it.
We're talking about a two-state solution.
Right. And again, most Israelis right now are in no mood to be generous to Palestinians. A lot of polls show Palestinian sympathy for Hamas. A lot of Israelis believe that any Palestinian state would be what Bibi Netanyahu calls Hamastan, essentially come to be controlled by terrorists. So no, serious people are not talking about going from where we are to going to a Palestinian state tomorrow. What they are talking about is beginning the process and essentially trying to find a new generation of Palestinian leaders and then basically say, we're prepared to work with you, but here are certain conditions that you must be willing to meet. For example, to rule out violence against Israel and so forth. So that's what the United States desperately wants to set in motion. It's what the Saudis and others want to set in motion. But you have an Israeli government that's hard over against it, and that's why we are where we are.
Could this be done independently of the Israeli government, Richard? I mean, could some of the people who want to see a rebuilt Gaza, could they be working behind the scenes to assemble future leaders as this war continues to progress with no end in sight?
I think you could begin that process. I think you could do it by the United States and others, for example, declaring what we believe the principles of a Palestinian state should be. Here's some of the parameters of it. Here's some of the conditions. We can begin those conversations. It would be impossible, though, to get to where you want to get without the support of an Israeli government. What we ultimately may need to do, Katie, is start a conversation in Israel where ultimately you have an election fought on this, where you have those who are hard over against it, representing the current government, against those in Israel who basically say, even if reluctantly, almost in the spirit of someone like Yitzhak Rabin, we've got to move in that direction, not as a favor to the Palestinians, but as a favor to ourselves. If we want to remain a democratic, Jewish, secure, prosperous country, if we want to maintain a good relationship with the United States. So again, what we want to do is help seed, I guess is the word I'd use, that political conversation in Israel. We got to do it in a careful way, given the collective trauma that is Israel still going on. You still got the hostages and so we shouldn't in any way underestimate the difficulties of doing this well and getting to an outcome that we want. But all I know is we've got to start the process, and the alternative of prolonged occupation is not a serious alternative.
You know, despite Kamala Harris's speech in which she called for a 6-week ceasefire and a follow-up meeting with at the White House with Benny Gantz, a member of Israel's war cabinet, you say chances of a ceasefire are pretty next to nothing at this juncture. Do you see any light? Okay. Do you see any light and possibility, any bit of a door opening for a ceasefire?
Yeah, I think next to nothing's too negative. I'm just saying that just because now the United States, President Biden, basically, if you remember, some days ago predicted it would come as soon as now, early this week. He went out on a bit of a limb. The Israelis seem to have come around to it in large part because they want to get more hostages out. and probably understand the political risk of carrying out military operations during the holy month of Ramadan. As I said, Hamas is digging in a funny sort of way. The fact that the United States and Israel seem to be leaning towards a ceasefire, Hamas sees leverage in that. Welcome to the Middle East. And Hamas has always shown a certain willingness to sacrifice Palestinians for their politics. Hence, they're locating Hamas fighters amidst schools and hospitals. So this is nothing particularly new. So I don't know if we're going to get a ceasefire. At some point, we will get one. We'll get temporary ceasefires. I think there'll be more exchanges. At some point, I don't know if we'll get a permanent ceasefire. What we'll probably get, though, is a period of much lower intensity military operations. I think something like that could become the new normal for Gaza. The associated question would be, do things then potentially heat up on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah and Lebanon? 80,000 Israelis, plus or minus, can't go back to their homes in northern Israel. I don't think that's a tenable situation for any Israeli government, not just this one. So, I think it's important, while we're focused on the humanitarian and security crisis that is Gaza, not to lose sight of the situation in the north as well.
And what about the West Bank? Tell us, keep us up to speed on what's happening, because a lot of tension was taking place there as well.
Yeah. That's where a preponderance of Palestinians live, in the West Bank, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million plus or minus, as opposed to the 2 million plus or minus in Gaza. That's where the Israeli settlements are, obviously, in that area. What you have seen is growing violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinians. There are plans to expand the footprint of settlements. So the possibility for the friction leading to outbreaks of violence there, I don't think any of us can dismiss that. I think it's likely to happen. The real question is at what level of intensity. And again, it points to the same thing, that the only way to stabilize this situation is if you add a viable political dimension, where in the West Bank and in Gaza, again, the analogy I draw, and if I've used it before with you, Katie, I apologize, is Northern Ireland, where the British essentially brought in security forces, not as the solution, but simply to make it clear that people who didn't like the status quo couldn't change it or shoot their way to power. But they then introduced a really significant political track. And negotiations took place, ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement and so forth. What we don't have now is the equivalent political track. All we have is the security dimension of policy, which yes is necessary, but is insufficient and can't succeed on its own.
Well, before I ask you about the Biden administration and what more it could be doing, Richard, to facilitate that very political structure that you just described, or political solution, I want to ask you about the hostages, because many of my followers say, people are not talking about the hostages anymore. There are 134 people who were taken hostage, is still holding. Sorry, many more were taken hostage. 32 confirmed dead, as I mentioned earlier. If Hamas were to release the hostages, wouldn't that sort of create the building blocks to some kind of ceasefire, or why aren't they?
Well, Hamas, first of all, the way you paint the situation's about right. We don't know how many of those hostages are still alive. The estimates are lower than that number you gave, might be closer to 100, but I think we're guessing. What Hamas obviously thinks is that if they were to release all the hostages, they would give away a lot of their leverage, and they would give away their deterrence against the Israelis. Because then there would be those Israelis who would say, we could use military force against Hamas now with impunity, because we wouldn't have to worry about retribution against the hostages. So, look, the reason Hamas took as many hostages as they did was no accident. They watched Israeli society over the years. They saw how powerful politically hostages were for Israel, and that's exactly why Hamas did what it did. This was they're using us hostages, innocent people, as an instrument of war. That's what this is about. So their concern, I'm not justifying it, needless to say. I'm trying to explain it. And so that's why, again, they're holding on to as many hostages. They want to use it to get people out of jail. They want to get it for ceasefires. And ultimately, ceasefires would allow some of the Hamas leadership to live or escape.
Let's talk about the prisoner swap real quickly, because one of the things that I guess that's a source of contention in terms of a ceasefire with Palestinian prisoners who are in prison in Israel being released. Isn't that problematic? I know that there's a whole mix of individuals, but wasn't one of the people released from an Israeli prisoner a Palestinian who was the mastermind or one of the masterminds of the October 7th attacks?
100%. And that's part of the risk, is that you release people out of these people, not all, but a lot are in prison because of the things they did, like carry out terrorist attacks or kill people. And it's unlikely, shall we say, that they've mended their ways while in prison. And when they get out.
But there are also people in prison, aren't there, Richard, who are there for much more minor offenses?
100%. Totally true, Katie. And it's a complete range from those who are there for what we would call political protests or some form of disobedience to those who are there for allegedly or killing Israelis. It runs the entire spectrum. And so obviously Israel is concerned about letting some of these people go just for the reason you say, that some of them could turn around and a week later they could be back on the quote unquote battlefield. So these are difficult issues. These are no one's claiming otherwise.
You have said that the most senior officials at the White House have come around to the fact in the last 4 or 5 months that the current approach to Israel is no longer working. And you've been very vocal about the fact that President Biden and Bibi Netanyahu are not on the same page, and how the U.S. needs to stake out a more independent approach to foreign policy when it comes to Israel. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, gosh, what should the Biden administration be doing differently in your view, Richard?
I mean, just to maybe restate what you just said, for 5 months, U.S. policy has largely been premised in the idea that Israel had the right to respond to the horrific attacks of October 7th. And what we have tried to do, we the United States have tried to do, was shape that response. And the United States has tried to shape that response to basically discourage Israel, for example, from using large ordnance in populated areas and the like, or undertaking attacks where there would likely be large numbers of civilian casualties. And we've tried to do that essentially through persuasion, privately as well, and then publicly a degree of criticism. It hasn't worked. The only area I can see is Israel has let a little bit of aid in, not a whole lot, but I don't see any fundamental changes to Israeli military strategy. And needless to say, there's been no Israeli introduction of a serious political corollary or dimension to their strategy. So I think what the administration has run up against after 5 months is a reality that American advice is being rejected. Let's just call it what it is. It's falling on deaf ears for the most part. So they're quite sure you can keep doing it, but it's a little bit about banging your head against the wall. It's not obvious to me it would have the desired effect. So the food drops are one thing you're seeing. You're seeing the United States takes, and the problem there is it can't operate at a scale that's sufficient to the need. You've had talk of the United States circulating a draft resolution in the Security Council on the terms of a ceasefire. That's another possibility. We'll see what the President of the United States says Thursday night in the State of the Union. But my guess is you will see him leaning farther forward in his criticisms of Israel, as well as in his advice about what Israel should do or what needs to be done in terms of adding a political dimension to what is going on. I've talked about other stuff. You also had the administration introduce some sanctions, economic sanctions, against certain settlers involved in violence. I've talked about certain type of economic sanctions against goods made in settlements that would be exported to the United States. So I think there's things that we could do. I don't think, it's to basically say, look, if you're not going to listen to us, you're not going to meet us halfway on what we think needs to be done, then we're gonna basically stake out a more independent policy. And I think the most important thing would be to put out the parameters of where the Israeli-Palestinian issue ought to go politically. And what we could do, Katie, is we could then get that enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. Think about it. When you were covering this for decades, when you were doing journalism day in, day out, you had UN 242. That was the resolution that ever since the 1967 war set the parameters for diplomacy, such as it was. Well, maybe we should do an update. Why not do UN 242 plus and think of something that builds on that and is maybe more explicit about setting forth some of the parameters of a political outcome, as well as some of the conditions, as well as maybe a process. I was heavily involved the last time I was working on these issues full time when I worked for President Bush 41. After the Gulf War, we had the Madrid Peace Conference in October of 1991. The first time Israelis and Arabs met face to face to talk peace. Well, maybe at some point we move to calling another peace conference. So I think there's things the United States can and should do rather than simply only work through Israel. I don't think we can give Israel a veto over U.S. foreign policy.
You also have suggested that Biden go around Netanyahu and give a speech directly to the Knesset. I mean, what?
Well, look, partially it's tongue in cheek. Bibi Netanyahu came to the Congress during Barack Obama's presidency. What did he do? He took the occasion of an address to a joint session of Congress to attack the Obama administration's policy toward Iran. It was, shall we say, not normally what guests to the United States do when they're offered the invitation to speak to a joint session. So my view was the president should go to the Knesset and go over the heads of this Israeli government, speak to the Israeli people. But again, he doesn't have to go to the Knesset to do that. He could do that from the Oval Office. He could do it from anywhere in the United States or Israel, or for that matter. The point, like the content, is what matters. And again, as I said, we'll see what he says Thursday night. We'll see what he might say subsequently. But I think that increasingly we have to become part of that Israeli conversation. They're going to decide. It's their country. But the United States, we have views on this, and we have stakes here. We have interests here. This is a relationship we care about, and Israel has no, shall we say, hesitation historically about speaking out here when it disagrees with American policy. That ought to be a two-way street. Thank you very much.
Does the Biden administration seem pretty impotent throughout all of this? And are they just simply not using all the tools, some of that you outlined through the UN, some of the others, potentially sanctions, a holistic approach that could bring pressure onto Israel? One of my followers asked, why is President Biden continuing to send arms to Israel? Why doesn't he stop or take funding away to get Bibi back to the negotiating table? I asked Kamala Harris about that. I said, should aid to Israel be more conditional when Bibi Netanyahu was delivering some pretty harsh rhetoric about occupying Gaza? And they don't seem to want to do that. Is that just a bridge too far?
Look, it's a fair question. Let me say two things. I favor the idea of placing certain limits on the use of American munitions that would be sent to Israel. So either we don't send certain munitions, for example, really large explosive bombs, or if we do, because Israel could conceivably need them in various scenarios, not involving the Palestinians, then we say you can't use them in these situations. I'd be prepared to do that. But let me just make a larger point here. I think the president, and you saw the way he reacted after October 7th, he has tremendous sympathy for, even empathy with Israel. He is of a generation that came of age. He's been in American politics for 50 years. So he came of age. He entered the Senate in the early 70s. That was right after the Six-Day War, right after the 67 war. I think the president came of age politically, established his framework for thinking about Israel when Israel was very much David against Goliath. And I think the president, we saw it after October 7th, the president's sympathies, his heart is there. I think he's found it very difficult to adjust to this Israel to Bibi Netanyahu's Israel, to this extremely right-wing coalition's Israel. This is a very different country. And I think he has been reluctant in some ways, or slow to adapt to that reality. I think the administration, more parts of the administration are more ready to go there more quickly than he is. But I think he's being pushed there. And so I think he's getting it. And one of the good things about moving slowly, I understand the costs, is that it sends a message to the Israeli people that he's doing it only reluctantly. And there's something to be said. Let me use a larger analogy I once used about Itzhak Rabin, why he was so popular in Israel, because he was a reluctant peacemaker. When he stood on the White House lawn that day, he said, "This isn't easy for me." Well, it's never easy to make concessions for peace. And that earned tremendous respect with the Israeli people. Someone like Shimon Peres was seen as a more enthusiastic peacemaker. And that left a lot of Israelis feeling a little bit uneasy. The fact that Joe Biden has been so supportive of Israel and is reluctant to be anything but, I think earns him a lot of goodwill in Israel. And it potentially earns him influence. He's got a hell of a lot more goodwill and support in Israel than does the Israeli prime minister right now. And I think the real question is whether he's prepared to use it, and can he use it in a way that doesn't boomerang? Because you know, and I know, as sure as the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to try to say, I'm the only Israeli who's willing and able to stand between Israel and American pressure. And Joe Biden is putting pressure on us to do things that we shouldn't do, to establish a Palestinian state that Hamas is going to run. So you may not like me, but you respect me and need me. So the United States, as it leans towards a more assertive policy towards Israel, has got to be really careful in how it couches it, because it could have undesirable effects, shall we say.
Can I ask two more quick questions from my social media followers? Do you have time for two questions?
Yeah, I'll do that if you say something nice about my weekly newsletter, Home and Away, on Substack.
Richard has a weekly newsletter where he talks about kind of what has happened in foreign policy on Substack. It's called Home and Away, and it's free, and it comes out every Friday. I highly recommend it. You can hear Richard's thought on all sorts of foreign policy issues. Somebody asked, what future do you see for Netanyahu based on how he's handled this situation? That's one question.
Well, look, a lot of people have been predicting that he's not going to be able to survive this. What happened on October 7th, yes, it's about Hamas, but it's also about Israeli intelligence and military failures. It's also about what's happened since October 7th, which I think has been a truly unfortunate and counterproductive strategy for the most part carried out by the Netanyahu government. But, and it's a big but, he's a survivor. A cat has 9 lives. He has more than that politically. And he's got this coalition that a lot of people don't want him to leave for whatever reason.
Is he more popular since October 7th?
No, ma'am, he's not. But there's no electoral test right now. People in a time of war tend not to switch horses. He has zero incentive to have new elections because he doesn't want to leave government, because then he's politically liable for prosecutions given the previous charges that are levied against him. So, look, his goal is to hang in and to hang on. And right now, I'd say he might have the upper hand. Yeah, that could change. You could have the coalition come apart. There's some people in the coalition who want, for example, to end the exemption of the ultra-Orthodox, don't have to serve in the military. That's the sort of thing that could split things. You remember the democracy protests in the streets before October.
Every Saturday, right?
Exactly. So, I'm not going to sit here and go to the other extreme and say he can't be moved, this government can't come down. But it's not a foregone, even though he's wildly unpopular, it's not a foregone conclusion that the government will collapse. The investigations are not going to start while he's still in government. And by the way, let me say something. I don't assume if there are new elections that he or someone like him doesn't do well. Israel is again, as we talked about a few minutes ago, there's been a kind of collective post-traumatic stress disorder for the society. Plus, Israel has gradually, even before this, become far more conservative, the country. The Labor Party essentially has died, and you have center-right and far-right parties that dominate Israeli politics. So I wouldn't assume that if there is an electoral process, that the alternative to Bibi Netanyahu is either it could be Bibi Netanyahu or it could be somebody else on way to the right. So it's not clear to me Israel is necessarily poised to adopt the sort of policies that many of us here in the United States think would be wise or in its self-interest.
Interesting. And finally, someone is asking, why are other Arab nations not stepping in to help Palestinians? And why, and a follow-up, why isn't Egypt, for example, under the same scrutiny as Israel when it comes to opening borders and providing aid?
Okay, well, lots of reasons, and I'm not going to say there aren't double standards here. There are. First of all, there's no love lost for the Palestinians in the Arab world. If you think about it, the Palestinians were often cheering for Saddam Hussein when he attacked and occupied Kuwait and threatening Saudi Arabia. So there's some memories in the Arab world. Hamas is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. If you're in Egypt, these are the people who turn your country upside down in the Arab Spring. No love lost there. Who's the principal backer of Hamas? Iran. No love lost there. The idea that you have large numbers of Palestinians moving into Arab societies like Jordan or elsewhere, people worry about the economic, but also the political and demographic consequences of all that. So it's one thing to support the Palestinian issue as a kind of political abstraction. It's something else to do it when it's much more tangible. And even something like rebuilding Gaza. Arab governments don't want to do that unless they're sure that there's going to be prolonged peace, open-ended peace, and that they're going to have a Palestinian government they like. And that can't be assured. So given the history and all the questions, I just don't see the Arab governments essentially being partners unless the politics of this fundamentally change. Until then, they're going to be more in a wait-and-see attitude.
Well, Richard, I'm so grateful when you spent some time with us, kind of talking us through these unbelievably complex issues. It's almost like such a puzzle, and yet it's really hard to see the pieces ever fitting together. Thanks, Richard. It's great to see you. And again, Richard has the newsletter called Home and Away on Substack. I highly recommend it. And I'll see you soon, I hope, Richard.